Specialists are not as unique as you might think. Hello and welcome back to Suck War Central. My name is CJ, and I'm here to drop what I think are some decently clever insights about Nen. You see, the specialist Nen category, as we understand it, is a bit of a lie. Specialists are often referred to as the quote-unquote other category when it comes to Nen abilities, and to in-world observers, that makes sense. Specialists are extremely rare, at roughly 1 in 3,000, and for the record, there's only about 600 people total in the Hunter Association. However, specialists also tend to be very narratively relevant, and we, the readers, have seen a grand total of 12 to 13 specialists in the Hunter x Hunter canon. This is enough to reveal that there actually tend to be only 4 general categories of specialist ability, and the specialist category isn't as open as you might think. So let's get to work categorizing those who defy categorization. The first category I'd like to explore is what I call the healing type. Normally, rapid healing is associated with enhancement, as demonstrated by Kurapika, who does not use this type and makes use of enhancement instead. However, quite a few specialists have been shown to make use of some variety of healing. For this category, I'd like to nominate Nanaka, Neferpito, Hina, and Renko. Now, after hearing all those names, I'm sure you have questions, so let me get to answering them. For starters, Renko is confirmed to be a specialist by an extra page Togashi inserted into Hunter x Hunter Volume 38. Secondly, healing is often not exactly the defining trait of Pito and Nanaka. However, we're looking at what exactly makes them specialists. Pito and Nanaka's other abilities can largely be explained by straightforward conjuration, manipulation, and emission. Since specialists can apparently make use of all sorts of affinities, we have to question if these healing abilities aren't just an application of enhancement. I would say that first of all, if we attribute this healing to enhancement, then there's not really anything in these Nen users' arsenals that we can actually attribute to specialization. But they're specialists, so they probably have something. Second of all, the enhancement healing that Kurapika demonstrated looks like regeneration and effectively causes the body's natural healing to dramatically increase thanks to a Nen boost. You could argue that Nanaka's healing is the same, but that's absolutely not the case for Renko and Pito. Rather than enhance the body's natural healing, Pito performs surgery on their targets, and Renko is apparently capable of reassembling a dismembered corpse. If the person is dead, the body's natural healing reaction stops, so enhancement healing wouldn't work. There's nothing to enhance. Thus, we can clearly conclude that these are applications of the specialist Nen category. I've got a few quick things to say about Hina before we move on. God, I never thought I'd be talking about this character. Anyway, I included Hina in this category because the Hunter x Hunter Omnibus Treasure number 9 refers to her as a specialist, but it's debatable if this information is canonical or not. If she truly is a specialist, then we are left with 2 possibilities that work with my theory. 1, she uses healing specialization in some way to help remove curses from her targets, which I think would make sense. Or 2, she isn't actually using the specialist Nen category. This is much more likely than you might think. See, according to Morena, specialists often don't realize their potential and waste their talents mastering different categories. From what we know of it, Hina's ability is actually quite similar to Abangane's exorcism, and he's not a specialist. Plus, aside from maybe the royal guards, the Chimera Ant's grasp on Nen is questionable at best. Like, despite being far more gifted, Lael created what was essentially a worse version of Krollo's ability, and Chitu created abilities that were either completely useless or just beyond his understanding. The Chimera Ant's potential far exceeded their intellects, and this makes it very likely that Hina simply made a crappy ability that doesn't take advantage of her potential and skill set. Until we know more, which may or may not happen depending on what Togashi wants to do with Gyro and the other Chimera Ants, that's the idea I'm personally going to go with. So, with that out of the way, I think we've thoroughly covered the healing subtype of specialization. Next up, we've got my personal favorite. I'm going to call it tracing specialization, since it involves tracing or copying the Nen abilities of others. This type is utilized by Krollo, Lael, and Kurapika. It's pretty self-explanatory. It involves appropriating someone else's Hatsu and using it as if it were one's own. Krollo does this through Skill Hunter, Lael does this through Rental Pod, and Kurapika does this through Steel Chain. Now, healing is a much more general sort of ability, but you've got to admit that copying powers is really specific, and it's definitely noteworthy that it's happened 3 times as a component of specialization. It was actually this pattern which influenced me to look into this to begin with, and I think it's pretty strong evidence that specialization is more limited and specific than we've realized. So, moving on, we've got another type of specialist with 4 members. This I like to call the temporal type. In my opinion, this type encompasses Terror Sandwich, Neon, Morena, and Kurapika again. Yes, Kurapika gets 2 types of specialization because he's just cool like that. In any case, I call this temporal specialization because it has to do with time. Okay, I feel like I've got to do some defending here. Neon and Terror Sandwich's abilities allow them to see into the future, so the time element in that regard is fairly straightforward. However, I'd like to argue that Kurapika's Emperor Time is also an application of this type of Nen. Before I make my case, let's define what Emperor Time actually does, since this is quite confusing, and the manga explains it much more thoroughly than the anime. You see, when it comes to learning Nen from categories outside your main one, there are 2 limiting factors. Firstly, there's the level limiter. To put it very simply, an ability's level is how complicated or advanced it is. So anyone can learn very basic enhancement abilities, but higher skilled ones like Dogman's enhanced sense of smell are probably only available to enhancers, maybe also to emitters and transmuters. Emperor Time does not raise Kurapika's level, so even if he has it active, he can't learn a very complicated enhancement ability. The second limiter I'm talking about is the efficiency limiter. See, learning Nen from categories outside your main one, even if they're a low enough level that you can learn them, just doesn't come naturally. In other words, it takes more time. If Kurapika, as a conjurer, wants to learn the exact same level 4 emission ability as an emitter, it's going to take him longer. Kurapika can technically get there, but he will be learning at 40% of the rate, meaning he'll have to spend 2.5 times as long training as that natural emitter to get the same result. What Emperor Time does is raise the efficiency of all of Kurapika's Nen categories to match that natural learning. So, while Emperor Time is not active, Kurapika would have 40% of the emission efficiency of a natural emitter. But with Emperor Time, his emission would be just as good as an emitter's. Basically, everything that Kurapika does, with the exception of Stealth Dolphin since that's specialization, he can technically do whether or not Emperor Time is active. He just hasn't spent long enough training for it to, work properly. Like, he can create a judgment chain and put a curse on someone, but with his emission as low as it is, it would just fizzle out if he tried to use it without Emperor Time. In other words, Emperor Time fast-forwards the clock on Kurapika's training, and makes him as strong as his hypothetical future self that did spend all those years training. So, you see, Emperor Time is actually a time-based ability, which should have been fairly obvious, hence the name, and it effectively propels Kurapika forward in time. There's also the fact that time is literally the currency Kurapika spends to activate his ability. With Nen contracts, there's always got to be some sort of semi-equivalent exchange. If we think of Emperor Time as Kurapika gaining access to his future self now, it makes sense that he would pay by giving up that future later. Look, it's difficult to phrase, but the point is that Kurapika is literally giving time in order to gain time. Similarly, I think Morena's Contagion is an application of the same principle. In order to gain strength in Nen that would normally take years of training, Contagion members cut other people's time in this world short. Kurapika's Emperor Time uses temporal specialization to accelerate a Nen user's strength into the future in the same way that Contagion does. Thus, even though it's a bit less straightforward and intuitive, I believe this all shows that Kurapika and Morena make use of the same type of specialization as Terror Sandwich and Neon. Last but not least, the final subcategory of specialization I've identified is what I call psychometry. This category, to my knowledge, only includes Pakunoda and Meleoron. Psychometric specialist abilities appear to directly reach into a target's mind and have an effect on it. In Pakunoda's case, this means reading and extracting memories. Meleoron's case is a bit trickier, but I think it makes perfect sense. You see, I argue that Meleoron doesn't just turn invisible, he erases his presence from the minds of those around him, thus affecting their minds with psychometric specialization. I have a couple points of support for this idea. First of all, it seems like this ability doesn't actually turn Meleoron invisible, since his partners in God's Accomplice act like they're able to see him. If he were actually turning invisible, this would be a bit hard to explain. Secondly, this scene of touching the bird shows that Meleoron is erasing his very presence from its mind. This bird's utter non-reaction to his presence proves that Perfect Plan is an ability that literally reaches into the minds of those who would behold Meleoron and writes him out of their perceptions. Therefore, I think there's strong reason to believe that this is an application of the same type of specialization as Pakunoda's, which can also rewrite a target's memories. I believe that little tidbit of information is another manga exclusive, by the way, revealed in this little blurb about Pakunoda's abilities from chapter 105. Seriously, you miss quite a bit by not reading the parts of the manga that are covered by the anime. All in all, I think I've made a pretty decent case for the theory that the specialist Nen category is more than just the quote-unquote other category, and it's actually a lot more limited and specific than you might think. If I'm right, this could be a useful framework for examining Hunter x Hunter, as it gives us a generally better idea of what specialists are capable of. For example, we can use this to get a much better idea of what ability Morena may want Volkson to learn. So, if you enjoyed this yap session, please feel free to join me for my discussion of that very subject next week, and I hope you have a wonderful day!